And good afternoon. As I've been doing these videos for a couple of weeks now, I've realized that I've never opened in prayer, and so why don't I do that today, just briefly in general terms, just going before our God. So pray with me. Father, we're just so grateful that you are the kind of God that we can turn to in times of need, and know that the things that overwhelm us do not overwhelm you, the things that surprise us do not surprise you. So you know exactly the place we would be even today. And we're thankful that we can have peace through you. We can turn to you with our cares and our concerns and cast them upon you. Father, we certainly do pray for those that are most affected by the COVID-19 situation, whether that be being diagnosed with the virus or family members being or friends, or just the economic impact that it's having on so many of us. So I just do pray that you make provision, that you particularly provide for those that call Living Hope home, and just be with them and continue to guide us in wisdom in the choices we make and the things we would just involve ourselves with. Just help us to use this time to draw deeper to each other, even in social distancing, as well as to you, through your word, through prayer, through various opportunities we have to just spend time with you and with our families as well. And so, Father, we just lift this time before you and seek to honor and glorify you through it. It is in your Son, Jesus Christ's name, that we do pray. Amen. And so we are working through 2 Kings chapter 5. One of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's tough to kind of say that, but all that it says and all that we learned from it, this man Naaman, a Gentile that God worked on behalf of and effectively through as we work through the story. And where we were yesterday is basically Elisha sends out a messenger to communicate the message to Naaman and tells him to go wash in the Jordan. And Naaman, being a person of influence and power in his nation, just didn't understand that. And walked away very upset. And really, it's so important to reinforce the principle we learned from that, and the fact that as we come before God, we need to come to him on his terms, and shouldn't be surprised or walk away because he's asking us to do something we wouldn't expect. And I think the nature of faith is that we do need to be prepared to engage with God the way that he is, the way that he instructs. So many things, so many temptations of the world, so many things that would be drawn to that God would say, no, it's wrong. And even though our subjective experience might not say that, or just the benefits we get from it seem to be inconsistent with what we would otherwise desire. And so oftentimes it is us submitting ourselves to God's will, even in spite of the wisdom or value that we might see in it. So this is really expressed in what Naaman says as far as his perspective. In verse 11, but Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. And again, just the epitome of oftentimes people's reaction to God. Wait a minute, it's not like I expect, so I'm just going to walk away. But basically, in the next verses, we really do learn just the kind of man that Naaman was. Probably the very thing that gave him success in terms of his leadership. So what happens next in verse 13? And really going through those first couple of verses 11 and 12 quickly because we really covered them yesterday. But basically, what it says in verse 13, Naaman's servant went to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? And so he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And I'll leave the end of the story, into that verse. But really, what does this reveal about Naaman? I mean, it basically shows that he was willing to listen to a servant. I mean, ultimately, he's willing to humble himself before God's protocol and God's paradigm and what God is instructing him to do. And again, we saw yesterday and just reinforced today how humility is such an important thing. When again, we're submitting ourselves to God, we recognize that his ways are higher than our ways. And so we need to humble ourselves in applying ourselves and orienting ourselves to his ways, which is represented in the story here. But here, Naaman is willing to listen. And what an important aspect of leadership. Not knowing what places of authority you're in. I think in some ways, all of us are in some place of authority in our lives, or at least we will be someday. And so to learn a very valuable principle of leadership is to listen to those under you. I like the fact that the servant calls him father. To me, that intimates the kind of close relationship that Naaman had with his servants. Even though he was a military person, he didn't lord it over the people of his house. Now, he might have been saying my father out of obedience, because Naaman said, make sure you call me your father. But what we can at least glean from this, is if it's more likely that the servant really had true regard. We saw the servant girl have true regard for Naaman and his wife in terms of coming up with a solution. And so, Naaman, again, shows himself to be a compassionate leader, shows himself to be someone who is willing to listen. And because he turned away from his rage, you know anger. We all know anger and how it can blind us. It can make us do things we regret. And, he offended me, so I'm just going to walk away. And how much we lose, certainly if we do that with God. How much do we lose when we do that with people? We let our anger control. We let some offense that happens be the thing that dictates what we do. And what we glean when we do humble ourselves and say, something, I'm going to try to gain some measure of understanding. I'm going to humble myself before this person. I'm going to try to engage and fix things. But basically, this is the very thing that Naaman does. And, it doesn't say anything about what he said in agreeing with them, and effectively agreeing with Elisha and his instructions. But he just shows the action. And I just love this. You talk about being a fly on the wall, being there as things happening. I just love the thought of being there, as he says, in verse 14. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. And just what an exciting experience that was for Naaman. To have this disease that had it affected his life for as long as he had it. Who knows when he contracted it. Well, one reason why I turned to this passage in the context of dealing with the coronavirus is leprosy was a very contagious condition. And so therefore, when you think about social distancing, you think about, what they would do to maintain health and well-being of those that are well. Leper colonies were formed. They would walk on the other side of the street. The ancient social distancing, happening. And so, you think about the alienation that Naaman experienced because of this, just the constant thought in the back of his head, even as he's having all the success. You've got leprosy. Remember that spot in your arm. It eventually will kill you. And again, all the things he tried, all the things that didn't work, and he obeys the prophet, and look what happens. I like to think of, what it was like for him. Like, he's doubting, why am I in the Jordan? This is a dirty river. This isn't as good as the rivers in Damascus. And he's going in 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and nothing happens. But then all of a sudden, when it's the 7th time, again, when you're responding to God's word, when you're responding to the guidance of the prophet, the promise of God, that is tied up in that, well, boom, 7 times, it's gone. And that is the nature of the power that God has over things in our life. That it's just a snap of a finger, it's just a wave of his hand, if you will, and we're healed. The problem is solved. Now that doesn't make us careless. We don't tempt the Lord. Again, in our current context, we can't understand that God would make us immune to corona so we can just do whatever we want. No, he honors our choices and makes us responsible for our choices as well. We've seen that on Sunday mornings and certainly in these daily videos. But even in regards to that, our ultimate hope or ultimate expectation are not the choices we're making, but the faith that we have in God, because God ultimately is control of everything. He's the one that is above all things. Even when I'm making safe decisions, I'm really trusting Him in terms of how we would provide in the midst of that, and even in spite of the safe decisions, or in addition, it probably would not in spite of it, but in addition to the safe decisions that I would make, if I were to like I didn't do something right, the mask slips, the thing, whatever, God has power over the coronavirus, and He can heal, and He won't do that across the board. It's not like we're coming to Him on His terms. It's the way He acts. And even though the way He acts might seem capricious, might seem, this person's healed, that person isn't. And that really has been the experience of mankind dealing with God for millennia. And that's where we see just the character and nature of God is not capricious. That He does have a plan. He does have a purpose. He is unfolding something. And we see as much benefit, as much usefulness, as much what God would desire to bring out of a situation in both someone being healed and someone not being healed. I think it is true for us that the ultimate promise we have is heaven, that again, to live is Christ, to die is gain. We're in the book of Daniel in our reading, and I just love Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response to the king, where he says, something? You're going to throw us in the fire because we're not bowing down to the idol. But whether God saves us, we know God can save us, but even if He doesn't, we're not going to bow to the idol. And that is such a great perspective in life. Hey, I may dip in the Joel, I think, because he's responding to the prophet's instruction, so it's going to happen. But I'm doing the best that I can. I'm engaging with God. I'm in His Word. I'm looking for His direction. I'm seeking His wisdom in my decisions, and making safe. And in spite of all that, this or that happens. Well, then there's an ultimate hope that God, even if you don't heal me, you're still God. I'm still honoring you. But just to know that here's just another biblical example of God overcoming the thing that man could not overcome. And particularly in the context of a contagious disease in terms of this. And what joy, again, must have filled Naaman's heart as he gets out of the water, and all of a sudden this thing that burdened his life for all his life is gone. And so therefore the natural response is then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know there is no God in all the world except in Israel, so please accept a gift from your servant." And isn't that the natural response? That as God has answered, as God has provided, as God has revealed, that the most natural response is, I see now, I believe. That is one of the purposes for miracles. As we see things happen in our lives that are miraculous in nature, the way that God is moving, the way He's bringing good out of bad situations. Again, it builds our faith as those who believe and know God, and it can also bring to faith the people that have not believed. This is a guy that has not believed God, but because of the miracle, because of the answer, that he comes to faith. He had to humble himself to meet God on His terms and do what God ordered him to do, and yet in doing that, the result was, and yet the best response, the fitting response isn't, okay, I'm healed, my situation has changed, so I'm going to go on my merry way. Naaman doesn't do that. Again, just highlighting the example he is to us, that no, he has the right response to say, something, God has done something for me, and I'm seeing something about Him that I never knew before, and I'm seeing it now. And I think as we move on in this passage, we're going to see that Naaman really did have genuine faith. And now, as we move on, next week in terms of the prophet's answer to Naaman's offer, no, I don't want anything. In spite of how you insist, I don't want money. And you know why that is? Because Elisha understood that Naaman thought that was the right protocol. In human dynamics and what he had done in the past, and okay, a soothsayer waves his arms and he does the thing and yada yada yada, and he give him money, and that's the normal protocol. Elisha says, no, you're in a different context here. I can't accept money because that would trigger you back into your protocol. Well, you know how God works? God works for free. That God gives us healing, and He's not all He's asking of you is that humility and that faith, is the obedience that comes from that. But don't think that God can be bought or sold. That somehow your money can be something that changes God or influences God. And just so many good lessons here in terms of what we learn about our God, about the protocol, the paradigms that he operates under, and how Elisha is just maintaining the purity of that. But in spite of all that, again, I'm getting a little too long, but next week we will see that God does condescend Himself for the sake of Naaman in terms of what He does allow that He otherwise wouldn't allow, but He does it for Naaman's sake and because of the humility and the faith that Naaman brings and chooses. Well, certainly you can read it, but there's the cliffhanger. There's a thing to bring you back next Tuesday to hear the rest of the story, or at least the next portion of it. All right, God bless.